Hi, folks. Welcome back. I think for a lot of people on the right and on the left, the idea that Israel is America's greatest ally isn't something they just accept anymore. It's something they're starting to question, and for many people, outright reject. And for people who are already skeptical of foreign influence in our government, it's beginning to feel less like a partnership between America and Israel and more like a situation where American interests are being subordinated to protect a certain class of people and a certain set of political interests, such as going to war on behalf of Israel in Iran. And what's fueling that perception isn't just foreign policy, by the way. It's what people are seeing happen here at home. There have been multiple incidents over the past few months that point to something deeper, a growing willingness to chip away at America's God-given liberties protected by the Constitution, especially when it comes to freedom of speech. And more specifically, when that speech involves criticism of Israel or people closely aligned with its foreign policy goals, such as the Israel First lobby. That's where this stops being about geopolitics and starts becoming a domestic issue. Take this incident out in Miami, for example. Raquel Pacheco, a former candidate for Miami Beach City Commission and the Florida Senate, had detectives show up at her door over a Facebook post. In the video she posted online documenting the interaction, you can hear her asking police officers, "Am I being charged with a crime?" And the answer effectively is no. This was about something she said online. Her comment was a response to the mayor promoting Miami Beach as a welcoming place. She replied to that, criticizing the mayor, saying he had supported rhetoric against Palestinians, attempted to shut down a theater over a film he didn't like, and failed to stand up for the LGBT community. Now, the mayor, Stephen Minor, is Jewish. And that context is part of why this situation has drawn so much attention. In response to the incident, the mayor, Stephen Minor, reiterated strong support for Israel and framed the situation as a police matter. And that's where people start asking questions, obviously, because regardless of who the mayor is or what his views are, the core issue here is whether someone can express political criticism of a foreign state and their genocidal actions without law enforcement showing up at their door to ask them questions. And by the way, this isn't an isolated situation. There have been multiple reports out of Miami where residents feel like their speech is being scrutinized or suppressed when it comes to criticism of Israel. Pacheco is now suing the city over what she argues is a violation of her First Amendment rights. And the broader point is simple. In America, you are allowed to question and criticize foreign governments, especially ones that receive billions of dollars in U.S. aid. Then you have the case involving Nicholas Ray Lynn, a 28-year-old from Spring, Texas, who went viral last year after police showed up at his door to question him following alleged online threats he made targeting Israel First figures like Laura Loomer, Josh Hammer, Carol Markowitz, and Seth Dillon. He was later arrested and extradited to Florida. According to the allegations, he made repeated statements saying these individuals deserve to be hung or in some cases should be hung. Now, obviously, that's harsh, aggressive, and inflammatory language. There's no question about that. But here's where the legal distinction actually matters. He's being charged with making anti-Semitic death threats. And that framing is doing a lot of heavy lifting because under U.S. law, there is no separate category called an anti-Semitic death threat. It's either a true threat or it isn't. And for something to qualify as a criminal threat, even if it were just a criminal threat, it has to meet a specific legal standard. It has to be targeted, it has to be credible, and convey a real imminent intent to carry out violence. Not just offensive language, not just political hyperbole. Courts have consistently ruled that even extreme, disturbing rhetoric can still fall under First Amendment protection unless it crosses that threshold. Now, in this case, authorities say these were not isolated comments. They involved repeated targeting, explicit language, and were tied to broader narratives. Law enforcement traced the post back to his home IP and phone, arrested him, and now he's facing felony charges, including written threats to kill and extortion enhanced as hate crimes with bonds set at $820,000. So again, the distinction here is critical. The question isn't whether what he said was offensive. The question is whether it crosses that legal threshold into true threat. And that's where a lot of this tension comes from, because people are looking at cases like this and asking whether that standard is being applied consistently or whether it's being interpreted more aggressively depending on the context. Now, Florida state law HB 269 is often brought into this conversation. That law doesn't criminalize speech. It focuses on conduct. It enhances penalties for intimidation, harassment, and threats tied to someone's identity while explicitly preserving First Amendment protections for nonviolent speech. But regardless of how the law is written, when law enforcement starts showing up at people's homes over political speech, it creates a chilling effect, and that's really what this is all meant to do. Because the broader concern that most people, most common sense people are expressing is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. We've seen over the last few months clips go viral where the heads of organizations like the ADL have openly pushed for increased moderation and monitoring a speech critical of Israel. Jonathan Greenblatt is on the record being very clear about pushing platforms to take a more aggressive approach, flagging content, tracking it, shaping enforcement, and looking for ways to silence any sort of criticism of Israel. And on top of that, you have Fox News pundits like Mark Levin actively advocating for restricting speech in the name of combating anti-Semitism. So you have pressure coming from multiple directions here, legal, cultural, and institutional, all pushing toward narrowing what people feel safe saying or should even be legally allowed to say, which is to criticize a foreign government we spend billions of dollars funding every year. And that brings us to this clip.
First time things like this have happened, but it really is problematic because so much of it is protected. And you hear people say, don't you believe in the First Amendment? They don't even know what the First Amendment believes. Do you want to deplatform people? You know, the libs do that. I don't have any problem with deplatforming Nazis or jihadis. I don't have any problem with deplatforming them. What does that mean, deplatforming them? A government law? No. It means that X or Twitter or Facebook or Amazon with Twitch and so forth says, you know what, you're a lowlife. We're not paying, get off our platform. What's wrong with that? It's called private enterprise. I got no problem with that. I mean, what if they have this horrific pornography on it? Is that okay? No, it's not okay. What if they have a bunch of drug addicts, shooting up all the time? Is that okay? No, that's not okay.
It's not the same.
Because our kids have access to it. People who are impressionable have access to it. What if they had people screaming at the top of the lungs saying, assassinate this guy and assassinate that guy? Well, they shouldn't do that. Why? What's the standard? You need to have a standard. What should the law be? What does the Constitution say? I just think we've taken this too far. Because we're not even talking about political speech, which is the most protected of all speech. We do limit speech. We limit speech pornography. We limit speech cigarettes on the air, and so we limit speech booze. We limit speech drugs, and I could go on and on and on. There's different types of speech. There's commercial speech, right? There's religious speech. There's political speech. They're babbling buffoons. We see that all over the internet. Most of that is protected too, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the kind of speech that really gets in the head of people who want to do grave damage to other people. Incitement. And I'm not talking about it in an ambiguous way. When you get a guy that talks about killing a senator, oh, I really didn't mean it. Or when you get a guy that says, yeah, I don't know if there was really rape. Can you prove it? And so forth on October 7th. Well, he's allowed to say that. But in the pattern of what this person is saying, what is it that they're trying to do? Have a real discussion? No, he'll say that, but he's not. The overthrow of the country? Let me ask you this. Do you think the founders would have put up with this?
Yes, 100%. The founders would have agreed with this, no question. They would have been behind this kind of speech without batting an eyelash for a multitude of reasons. Number one, the founders were extremely skeptical of foreign influence in our government. That's exactly why the Emoluments Clause exists in the Constitution. They had to literally fight a war to break away from foreign influence, that being England. And they also understood that foreign governments and people aligned with them would continue to try to influence American politics, and they built safeguards against that. More broadly, they were deeply skeptical of concentrated power in general, whether foreign or domestic, because they knew how easily it could distort a republic. The idea that speech criticizing foreign governments or political actors tied to them should be restricted or pushed out of the public square runs directly against that instinct. Number two, we're talking specifically about criticism of a foreign government, that being Israel. That's what you're advocating to restrict here, Mark Levin. You're saying you want to ban Nazis and jihadis, but let's be honest about how those labels are being used and why they're being applied so broadly. They are being used as political weapons, as cudgels. You're applying those labels to people who are critical of the state of Israel. That's what this actually is. And look, on its face, what Levin is proposing might sound reasonable to some folks. Look, I understand. Nobody wants incitement of violence. Nobody wants explicit threats. We don't want to live in a disordered, violent society. But the problem isn't the edge cases. The problem is who defines those labels and how broadly they get applied. Because if the standard is subjective, if we have people like Levin defining what's what, and it's all based on labels that can be stretched to fit convenient political opponents to their Israel first ideology, then what you're really arguing for is selective censorship that benefits your political lens, not principled moderation, not a consistent standard, just selective enforcement based on protecting what you value as most important to your political agenda. And we've already seen how those labels get used. We just spent years watching legacy media call Donald Trump a Nazi, compare him to Hitler, and frame his supporters in the same light. So now, ironically, you have never Trumpers like Mark Levin using the same rhetoric to protect his Israel first interests, saying, well, people like that shouldn't have a platform. Do you actually see the problem, you neocons? Once you accept that premise, the category can be expanded indefinitely. Today, it's Nazis and jihadis. Tomorrow, it's all Catholics, because apparently, according to certain folks in the California GOP, being a Catholic automatically makes you an anti-Semite. Who would have known? I found out a few weeks ago. Yes, folks. By the way, Mark Levin is speaking broadly here. You have to assume this is, at least in part, in response to some of Hassan Piker's statements. And let me be clear, Hassan has said some absolutely terrible takes over the years. I don't stand behind any of them. There are clips going back a decade, basically. You can find videos of mine from as far back as 2022 where I'm criticizing Hassan for saying those same insane things that Mark Levin is bringing up here. This is nothing new. But Hassan has a right to say those things. He does. It's protected under the Constitution. It is political speech. He is a political commentator, after all. Now, if he's talking about people being gutted in the streets, then hell no. He shouldn't be saying that. Hassan should not be saying any of that. That crosses a line. That's not protected speech. That's where platforms step in and are supposed to enforce their own rules, but platforms like Twitch and YouTube never did. Why has Hassan Piker been able to go and fire up his stream and say some of the most egregious things that many Americans have heard on the internet, and there's zero consequences? I guess that's a question for the ages. Now, back to Levin. What he is doing is trying to collapse categories here. He brings up pornography, drugs, explicit calls to violence, but those are not comparable to political speech. We already have legal standards for incitement. If someone is explicitly calling for violence, like, hey, you go off that person, hey, you go attack that group, that is not protected speech. That crosses into criminal territory, and there are already laws in place that deal with that. But that's not what he's really talking about. That's not what Levin is talking about. He's talking about speech he believes is dangerous, speech he believes could influence people in harmful ways. Ironically enough, it's all speech critical of Israel, which conveniently all fits into this subjective standard as to what is acceptable criticism of this foreign nation. And once you move into that territory, deciding what speech is too persuasive, too influential, too dangerous to be allowed, you're no longer operating within a free speech framework. You're operating within a framework of pure ideological control to protect the state of Israel and its interests within the United States. And then you layer in the current political climate that we're currently living in, where criticism of Israel is increasingly being lumped into all of those categories. You're starting to see people who are critical of Israeli policy being branded as extremists, as dangerous, as outside the bounds of acceptable discourse, myself included within my own party. In fact, a few weeks ago, I did a debate on a very prominent YouTube channel, and I was quite literally harassed by all the Zionists that were present debating in favor of Israel because I dared to be a politician, a Republican running for office in California, who was critical of Israel's outsized influence within our country's policies. And needless to say, by the way, the majority of those Zionists who are now identifying as conservatives and Republicans were all Democrats before the Democrat Party ditched the Israel lobby. Now, look, all that being said, all of this ties directly into the broader conversation that's been just playing out for years about Zionism and its narrative control in America. There is a very noticeable shift, particularly among conservative media figures, towards supporting more aggressive moderation of speech. There is a very noticeable shift, particularly among Israel First conservative media figures, towards supporting more aggressive moderation of speech, especially when that speech is critical of Israel. And that shift didn't happen in a vacuum. This is why this whole situation is very interesting to me, because Mark Levin didn't care about Hassan's comments for the last 10 years. Nobody in the space did. I've been talking about this for the last 4 or 5 years. These clips have been out there. They've been circulating. They've been criticized by many YouTubers, but nobody on the right. So why now? Why is there suddenly this coordinated interest from conservative media in pushing this conversation around Hassan? Well, it's obvious. It's because Hassan has become one of the most vocal critics of the state of Israel, and that criticism is starting to chip away at their carefully curated Israel First narrative. That's what this is all about. It's hitting where it hurts. It's hitting the Israel First stronghold in foreign policy discussions. And a lot of these people, these Israel Firsters, do not want public sentiment in the United States turning against Israel. That's why you're now seeing this push to restrict speech from conservatives. That's why you're seeing calls to deplatform people, to label them Nazis, to remove them from the conversation, because it's hurting their objectives. But the founders would have been completely against all of this. Completely. They were deeply skeptical, as I mentioned, of any sort of foreign influence in our government. That's why it's hilarious that Mark Levin is actually trying to appeal to the founders here. The founders had deep distrust in institutions, whether government or private. That's why they created the Articles of Confederation and literally had that fail as a form of government before having the Constitutional Convention, because they basically didn't want any sort of centralized power in our country, especially one that could be susceptible to foreign influence. And that's why open debate was valued at the time, and the standard for restricting speech, especially political speech, was set so high. All that being said, if there's any single country influencing American politics, influencing American media, influencing American public opinion, that country is not above criticism. It should be the most criticized country. And that applies across the board, whether it's the Israeli government, the Ukrainian government, the Russian government, the Chinese government, the English government. And look, as I'm making this video, King Charles is addressing Congress. Every country that attempts to influence the United States, all of them should be open to criticism. That's the standard. And what Mark Levin is advocating for here, even if he frames it as private enterprise, is a restriction on criticism that benefits his agenda to put Israel first and foreign policy ahead of domestic policy. It's narrowing the scope of what people are allowed to say based on labels that are being applied politically and not consistently. And once you accept that premise, you're opening the door to a system where boundaries of acceptable speech are constantly shifting based on who has the power and what narratives these sorts of foreign influence advocates want to protect. That's the issue. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned how so many lifelong Zionists were swapping over from Democrat to Republican purely because they felt the Democrat Party no longer represented their Israel First policy. And that's not speculation, folks. I'm not just making that up. You literally have people like Alan Dershowitz on the record admitting to this on Piers Morgan. This is what he had to say.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
and the reality is
that putting America first is very important. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but the reality is this
an alliance with Israel puts America first.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, that's your position. I think the problem is that the polling is so bad.
That's my position.
For Trump personally, the approval rating is crashing, and
we have to change that. That's why I joined the Republican Party, to help that.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll see you as the unlikely savior of the Republican Party, Alan, which would be most entertaining.
Yeah. Not a savior,
but
somebody who at least wants to put a little bit of his thumb on the scale.
Boo. Now, what Alan Dershowitz is saying here isn't really that extraordinary. In fact, there are so many people, so many Zionists who no longer feel like they have a home in the Democrat Party and are now moving to the Republican side. I see it constantly. Almost every Republican meeting I go to, every grassroots event, there's a noticeable new person, a new Zionist who introduces themselves, and they genuinely believe that the Republican Party is going to become the new home for their priorities, especially when it comes to Israel. But what they don't seem to understand is what the Republican Party actually is at its core right now. Even outlets like The New Yorker have pointed out that a large percentage of Republicans, around 75%, have a negative view of the state of Israel and are opposed to sending foreign aid to them. The shift in the base is very real. It's America first, not foreign policy, Israel first. And that's where this whole framing starts to really fall apart, because aiding Israel is not America first, as Alan claims. It is Israel first. And if we're being consistent, all foreign aid should be cut, not just to Israel, but to every foreign nation. But if we're talking about priorities, then yes, Israel comes first in that sense. First in line to get cut off from that aid. Let Israel fend for itself. Let it fight its own battles, its own wars that it loves to start in that region. That's what sovereignty actually looks like. That's what putting America first actually means. You don't prioritize another nation's interests over your own domestic needs and then call it patriotism. And when Dershowitz says, I'm basically a foreign policy Republican, I'm still a domestic Democrat, what he's really saying is that he sees the Republican Party as a vehicle to push a specific foreign policy agenda. He's not aligning with the party on its core domestic priorities. He's aligning where it benefits him strategically. He even admits it outright. He wants to put his thumb on the scale. That's not subtle. That's not ambiguous. That's someone openly saying they want to influence the direction of the party. Now, look, the Republican Party has always been a big tent party, right? According to Trump, we're the big tent. That's true. People can come over. That's totally fine. But what's not going to happen, at least if the base has anything to say about this, is the party being reshaped to put Israel first. That's not where the momentum is going. If anything, the trend is the opposite. Israel is becoming less of a central priority for the average Republican voter, not more. And that's just the reality. That being said, it is without irony that people, the Israel firsters, are celebrating at Alan Dershowitz coming over to the Republican Party. And that's where things start to get a little absurd, because we're talking about a guy who has been tied to the Epstein files, a guy who has faced serious allegations in the past from Savannah Guthrie, who was one of the primary people abused by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, a guy who spent years doing legal and political work on behalf of the Clintons. That's who we're celebrating. This is the win. The same party that ran on taking down the deep state is now applauding when someone in the deep state tied to Jeffrey Epstein decides to switch sides just because it conveniently fits his Israel first agenda. I see. That contradiction is truly hard to ignore. You can't spend years building a movement around anti-establishment energy, around exposing corruption, around draining the swamp, and then turn around and cheer when someone from that exact ecosystem walks through the door. It just doesn't line up. Now, given everything we've discussed so far in this video, you now have reporting out of the military showing that a bill was introduced in 2024 by Representative Max Miller and Guy Reschenthaler, and it's being framed as support for Americans serving in Israel, but not in the way you might think. What this bill actually proposes is extending certain U.S. military-style protections to dual citizen Americans serving in the IDF, effectively giving them protections similar to those provided to U.S. service members. Now, let me break down what all of this means, because the framing versus the reality are two very different things. Under current U.S. law, benefits and protections tied to military service are specifically for people who serve in the United States Armed Forces. That's the entire structure. You serve the United States, you get those protections. That's the deal. What this bill is attempting to do is blur that line. It would extend certain legal protections, things like the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which helps with things like interest rates, evictions, legal protections, and USERA, which guarantees your job when you come back from service. This bill would extend those protections to Americans serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, effectively treating that service as if it were U.S. military service for those purposes. And here's where it really gets wild. We do not do this for any other foreign military, not for Ukraine, not for the French Foreign Legion, not for any other allied country. Americans have gone abroad and fought in all kinds of conflicts. There is no system in place that says, hey, you serve another country, we're going to give you U.S. military-style protections. That has never been the standard. In fact, the State Department has historically made it clear, you go fight for another country, you do so at your own risk. So what you're looking at here is not some neutral policy adjustment. This is a very specific, isolated push to treat one foreign military differently than every other foreign military in the world. And that raises a very obvious question. Why? Why is this the exception? Because once you break that standard, once you say that U.S. protections are no longer tied strictly to service for the United States, you open the door to a completely different framework. And look, to be fair, this bill doesn't immediately hand out full veteran benefits. It's focused on legal protections, not direct payments. But let's not play dumb about how all of this works, okay? Once you establish the precedent, once you codify the idea that service in a foreign military can qualify you for U.S. protections, you've fundamentally altered the structure of military service in America. And even the reporting on this makes it clear. This could open the door to broader expansions later. And also, why Israel? Why does it always come back to Israel? I'll let you answer that question in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, folks. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.